I've spent a lot of my life in the bush. Probably not as much as Ray and maybe some of the rest of you, but my dad was a forester and I lived in a logging camp for the first 4 years of my life. That was 60 miles back in the bush north of Espanola. And we were in and out of the bush all of my childhood years, and I have a husband that still takes me out there all the time, sometimes when I don't want to. So, Frances Osborne and Catherine Myers were walking down my back lane last fall, and they ended up in my backyard asking questions. And we came to the conclusion that we should do a presentation on invasive plants. And I looked at them and said, "Who's giving this?" And they both said, "You." So I set out to do some research. And Catherine and Frances and also Elizabeth Bond and a few other people have given me a lot of feedback on this. And I really appreciate that because I could not have gotten to this point without them. So I'm grateful for that. We're going to start with introductions. Now I just have to remember how to use this. Okay, so the first thing we have to know is what an ecosystem is. The soil and climate are major contributors to determining what plants naturally exist in a given area. And a native plant is a plant that naturally exists in an area and is connected ecologically to other plants and animals that exist in that surrounding area. These plants and animals have evolved together over thousands, even millions of years, and together form an ecosystem, a web of life. The other definition I found is what native is: a plant or animal that has evolved in a given place over a period of time sufficient to develop complex and essential relationships with the physical environment and other organisms in a given ecological community. That definition came out of the book The Living Landscape, which is in the library by Rick Dark and Doug Tallamy. The background here shows you some of our very typical ecosystems that's on the forest floor. There's a beech seedling in there. There's also a maple seedling, probably a balsam seedling. There's Canada Mayflower, which is our native lily of the valley, wintergreen, twin flower, the pink flower down in the far bottom, and I think that's mostly all that's in that picture. An invasive plant is an alien species that, inserted into an ecosystem, results in reducing the ecosystem in diversity. It doesn't mean whether it's pretty. It doesn't mean that it's still, other things might live there, but if the diversity is reduced, then it's considered invasive. It can even threaten human health and the economy. When we're talking about the economy, usually the consideration there is an agricultural one. So for instance, if there's plants that would interfere with good grazing for grazing animals, or perhaps things that might seed into growing crops that would interfere with what they're harvesting. Human health, things that are poisonous. The example I had is giant hogweed, which is poisonous. It's an invasive plant, but it's also poisonous. Okay, so what's the concern? Loss of biodiversity means that some of the different plants and animals that combine to form an ecosystem no longer survive there. This impacts not only the plant life that anchors the ecosystem, but also the animal life that's entwined with it. Loss of biodiversity leads to less resiliency in coping with stressors such as fire, drought, and climate change. So because you have less things there, one thing or the other that maybe wouldn't survive an event and then come back later through some deposited seeds, you have less things that can recover, and that's the problem. So I'm just going back to one of the resources that I found. Other impacts include forestry operations by competing with seedlings for light, nutrients, and water. Recreation opportunities by puncturing tires, obstructing trails, and reducing aesthetics. Water quality and quantity by increasing erosion and sedimentation. Some of the introduced species do not have the root systems to hold the banks, and yet they love to take over banks. A good example is Japanese knotweed. And of course, they'll disturb ecosystems also by disrupting photosynthesis and nutrient cycles. So you might not have the nutrient you need to support the plant. The first example of that comes to mind, for instance, is that we have quite a few lady slippers in this area. And people sometimes like to think they can dig them up and take them home and put them in their garden. But lady slippers need to grow under pine trees because there's an interaction there that the lady slippers need to survive. And taking them home in your garden is just providing them with certain death. So there's a lot of things that go on in an ecosystem that we're often not that aware of. I don't even know half of it either. There is legislation at the federal level, but the jurisdiction rests with the provinces, and so I've chosen to look at the provincial legislation here in Ontario. So in Ontario, invasive species are managed through the Invasive Species Act. It's all on the line. The Act names prohibited species and restricted species. So it's illegal to import, deposit, release, breed, grow, buy, sell, lease, or trade plants that are named under these two designations. Prohibited species are also illegal to possess. There are no terrestrial plants that are named as prohibited species. The only plants under that designation are water plants, and that's not my topic here because that's not my expertise. There are a lot of water species that are on those lists, primarily to do with our waterways. A lot of fish, a lot of crayfish, shellfish, those sorts of things. There's invasive diseases like whirling disease that they have actually poisoned lakes to try and get rid of. Those are not the topic tonight. Tonight we're talking about terrestrial plants. This website provides a link to Grow Me Instead, which is a guide produced by the Ontario Invasive Plant Council. The Ontario Invasive Plant Council is an NGO. It's I'm not sure who started it, but there are several of them that I found, and this is one of the main ones. They produce a lot of literature and guidelines for dealing with invasive plants. There's also an Ontario Invading Species Awareness Program, which is a partnership between the Ministry of Natural Resources and the Ontario Federation of Anglers and Hunters, and that's on invadedspecies.com. All of these organizations are intertwined. So on invadingspecies.com, you will find links to the information that the Ontario Invasive Plant Council has provided. And Catherine is just waving something at me. I have a list of resources at the end of this talk, and there is a handout if you want to take a piece of paper home. Okay. So in this act, the following are named as restricted species: black dog strangling vine, Phragmites, which is also known as European common reed, Japanese knotweed, Bohemian knotweed, giant knotweed, Himalayan knotweed. Knotweeds are not good. and Tree of Heaven. I'm going to talk about some of these a little later. I think the worst one we have in Deep River, we have Japanese knotweed in Deep River, and I think that's the scariest of all of the plants that we have. There is dog strangling vine in town, because Catherine tells me.
No, you told me.
I don't recall seeing it. I don't know very much about it. Tree of Heaven is more recent. It is a tree that will grow in virtually any kind of situation, in any kind of habitat, and it just crowds everything out. Big problem in southern Ontario. We probably have a little less problem here because we have colder winters, which makes things slow down a lot, but a lot of these are pretty bad. This is what the Grow Me Instead booklet looks like from the Ontario Invasive Plant Council. This is downloadable off of their website. They have one for Northern Ontario and one for Southern Ontario. This plant primarily, it gives you some information at the beginning, but primarily lists the species that are of concern. So we're not just looking at things that are on that list. Those are the ones that are restricted. We're looking at any plant that they would consider to be invasive, and what you could purchase or find to grow instead of what the plants that they consider to be invasive. And surprise, surprise, they're the most robust and exuberant growers that many of us have in our garden. So what makes invasives resilient? They often have one or more of the following characteristics: high seed production, seed dispersal by birds, so the birds love to eat them and then they plant them wherever they fly. They tolerate a wide range of growing conditions. They spread underground, so they have very robust root systems and regrow quickly when disturbed, some of them more than others. Some of them lack natural predators to keep their population under control, and some of them have a detrimental effect on the soil. So in this next section, I want to take a look at invasives that are in Deep River. And many of these are familiar to all of us. This is the burning bush. It shows up on the top of lots of lists, or close to the top. It does produce a lot of seed, and it's really common around Deep River. I'm not aware of any that is growing in a forested area or a natural area around Deep River, so maybe it's not as much of a problem here, but certainly when I was gardening in people's yards, we had a client who had a whole hedge of burning bush, and there were many, many seedlings underneath those bushes. So they were all from dropped seed, and the seed had all germinated. And there were lots of seedlings. In fact, we collected them and took them home. Japanese barberry. So there's one of these out on the hiking trails or the walking trails along the river that's between the fire break and the end of our loop. I usually go by in the wintertime and take the seeds off of it. It must have been planted by a bird. When I first found it, barberry has like little spikes on the underneath of the branches. I took it home to figure out what it was, and I couldn't believe that there was one out there. So they also produce a lot of seed, as you can see from this. I'm not familiar with them having so many seedlings underneath their bushes as burning bush, but certainly I found one out where it really shouldn't be. In some of my research, one of the things that's mentioned is that a bunch of these shrubs put together provides very good refuge for ticks. So there's a few surprising things I learned along the way. This one's very familiar. Goutweed. This thing grows anywhere. When I moved into my house 40 years ago, it was growing all along a cedar hedge that has shallow roots and lots of them, and it was even underneath a white pine that was hanging over. So, and then of course it will do sun too. This also is growing in another place in the bush where probably someone discarded some garden cuttings. This is Japanese knotwood. There's Japanese knotwood in, I think, quite a few locations around town. Even the smallest piece of root of this plant will grow into another plant. The soil needs to be sieved if you want to remove this plant. This is probably the scariest of all of the invasives that I'm talking about tonight. You can see each of these two. I've labeled the slides with what trait or what trait gives them the resiliency. This is Phragmites. It also, as you can see from the root system, lovely big tubers that will just keep growing. Phragmites is everywhere along the highways in southern Ontario. It's a big problem in southern Ontario. And it's not very far away from us, if not here. For a plant that lacks natural predators, the first one that comes to my mind is purple loosestrife. This plant is native to temperate regions of Europe, Asia, and North Africa, and Eastern Australia. It became such a problem for our wetlands that a beetle was imported from its native habitat and tested by various agencies for a while. And in 1992, the Canadian and US governments approved introduction and release of this beetle as a biological control for purple loosestrife. That's a big deal because it's not done very often. The Fletcher Wildlife Garden in Ottawa is one garden that specifically references it in controlling the plant in their garden area. There is a website that specializes in release of that beetle that talks about where it's been released in the province. The trouble with purple loosestrife and also Phragmites is they fill in wetlands so thickly that, for instance, turtles can't climb out and sun in nice weather. So they really, really reduce the habitat that is in the area. I actually tripped over an article from Philadelphia where a person who works in one of their natural areas in the Philadelphia area says that he sees more loosestrife than he used to, but they're hoping that that's a balance between the beetles and the plants. So fewer plants, fewer beetles. The beetles they introduced only eat the leaves and seeds and the whole plant of the loosestrife. They don't eat anything else. And hopefully it stays that way. Dog strangling vine. This vine, in addition to wrapping itself around things and probably strangling them from its name, also releases a toxin into the soil that makes it harder for other plants to live in the same soil. And that's not the only invasive plant. I tripped over this in a couple of cases. I just don't remember the other ones, but dog strangling vine was one of them. So how do these things spread around? Well, first of all, the wind is going to blow their seeds, right? So it's not a surprise that they'll spread along highways and hydro lines and pipelines. The wildlife that comes in contact with them will collect things. The birds will eat their seeds and drop them somewhere else. The other wildlife will pick up things on their fur, and those will get caught on another plant. Vehicles, cars, and construction equipment can pick that up on their tires, and if you're not cleaning them off, then that's going to be taken to another area. Horticulture, so all of us in our gardening, moving soil. Somebody told me of a load of soil that they got that had Japanese knotweed in it, and before they realized what it was, it had grown into a lovely clump. And we all know this if you're a gardener, like every time you get topsoil in, at the hospital, the topsoil we brought in for the family health center was full of, well, there was twitchgrass in it for sure, but it was full of weed seeds and it had to be weeded all summer, even though we mulched it heavily. But it was just full of weed seeds, including a tomato, if anybody was out there. There's a huge tomato plant that grew out of the soil, and that was not planted. It came in on the soil. Gardeners share plants, and some of those plants you share when you're not really realizing what the effects of the plant are. So I can think of plants that we sold at plant sales 10 years ago, and I would not do that today. And what we do with our yard waste is something that needs to be taken into consideration also. Waterways also, so in Southern Ontario, Japanese knotweed, for instance, is a huge problem in waterways. It does not hold the banks, so there's more erosion. So of course the plant itself is going to end up in the waterway, and the current will take it downstream, and spring flooding will rip it off. And so it's going to travel further downstream. So that is a concern. And of course, pets and humans will pick them up on their shoes and boots and paws and fur and clothing, and can fall off and end up somewhere else. So those are the pathways that move them around. So why should you not dump your garden debris in the bush? So first and foremost, because of our topic tonight, you can spread non-natives into the bush. Did you know worms are not native? So in Algonquin Park, they ask fishermen to dispose of their bait worms in the garbage. They are not native. All of our lovely maple trees did not evolve with earthworms. So the less worms we put in the bush, probably the better it is for the bush. And the other issue is that we can smother native plants, because if they're not blooming, a lot of us don't know they're there. We have a lot of lady slippers, as I mentioned. And many of these plants that we love so much in the bush are along the forest edge. And that's where a lot of the dumping happens too, because it's the easiest place to get to without pushing a wheelbarrow or carrying a bag further into the bush. So what should you do with your yard waste here in town? You can compost it at home if you have room. And I'm not talking about invasives here. You can bag it and leave it at the public works yard. The public works yard keeps all of those back in behind all of their buildings. They have an area there where they collect all of those bags, and they get stockpiled, and they eventually do break down into compost. We've actually used them in the gardens that we have refreshed around town. We've used that in preference to any topsoil that you can get, because most topsoil you get I wouldn't call topsoil. Or you can take it to Baggs Road landfill, where they have a huge pile there, and they chip things and they move that around and have equipment that they push it around and try and get all of it to compost. Yes.
Ask the questions now as you go, or later?
If you have a question, I'll entertain it, sure.
So just if there was Japanese knotweed in my bag of stuff that I'm leaving for Public Works or Baggs Road, is there a certain amount of time that makes it defunct?
We're going to talk about Japanese knotweed and invasives later.
Okay.
So the last thing I have is referred to a quick reference guide to managing invasive plants in Ontario. This is a guide for invasive plants and how to get rid of them by individual plant. Okay, and I'll talk a little bit about that later. I want to talk about Japanese knotweed specifically later. Okay?
Great.
So, yeah, we'll talk about invasives later. So the Grow Me Guide also has a list of invasive plants of Northern Ontario. This is kind of an interesting list. So what's on here, I mean, some of the things that we have mentioned are on this list, but there's a lot of things that people might have in their garden on this list too. There's a lot of honeysuckles because they produce a lot of berries. False spirea is on there, which is a pretty exuberant shrub. Giant hogweed is on there too. There's a bunch of other ones on here that we're going to talk about later. There's more. Miscanthus is a grass. We planted miscanthus up at the highway in front of the monument. I don't know what the species name of the miscanthus is that we planted there because I don't know what it is. Oxeye daisy is the daisy that's in all our ditches. And some people in town like to let them flower, and they are very pretty. But when I started working in the library flower bed, somebody had let them flower and seed, and I weeded out hundreds of them. They produce a lot of seed. Most of our native, that is not a native either. The oxeye daisy is not native. To my surprise, the yellow iris, which is at the bottom of that list, is also in the library flower bed. I did not know that. It's classified as invasive because, or it's on this invasive list because it is a pretty tough plant and it will grow well in places that maybe other plants don't. That yellow iris looks like a Siberian iris except it's yellow. And the issue with it is long streams where it can take over the shoreline. It's much more aggressive than other Siberian iris. So Catherine asked me, are there any non-native plants that are not invasive? Daylily, we find that around. It's in the wildflower guide. Those came with European settlers. It's native to Asia, was smuggled out of China, the first one, back when China didn't want to let things like that out of their country. It was brought probably by early settlers. The common lilac, I was shocked to find out from Richard when we were discussing trees one time a few years ago that there are no native lilacs in Ontario. I'm going, what? There's lilacs all over the place. They were brought by early settlers. They're native to the Balkan Peninsula, so Romania, Serbia, Bulgaria, and Macedonia. They're all over southern Ontario along the 401. You can see them if you drive through there. When they're blooming, you'll notice them. And we have a huge clump of them in front of Mackenzie. The dandelion. The dandelion is not invasive. It likes to join the party. But it joins all the parties. So it's native to temperate and subarctic Eurasia, and it's considered a non-native naturalized plant in the Americas. And it was brought by European settlers for both medicinal and food purposes. It's all edible, that plant.
So Barb, those ones are not invasive, going back to the definition at the beginning,
They're
not affecting the ecosystem.
They don't reduce the diversity in an ecosystem. Okay, so one plant some of you might be familiar with that is really pretty as a roadside plant in the East Coast is lupins. They are considered invasive because they can take over a whole plot and nothing else will grow there. Yes, they look pretty, I'm not denying that, but they are considered invasive. I looked them up in New Brunswick and Nova Scotia, and I didn't think to check PEI. I suspect also Newfoundland. So what have we got around Deep River? Well, I've mentioned Japanese knotweed a few times and burning bush. We've looked at pictures of these. Virginia creeper is actually native to eastern North America. I have not really seen that in the bush around here, so I don't think it's really native to our local area. Somebody can correct me if I'm wrong. I have some personal experience with Virginia creeper, but we're going to go through pictures of these. A common reed, which is Phragmites, we've mentioned that a few times already. Japanese barberry, periwinkle. There's a lot of periwinkle around town. Lily of the valley. A lot of people associate this with their parents or grandparents. Garlic mustard, creeping bellflower, which when I was gardening in different people's gardens was reasonably common. Yellow archangel, carragana, and Siberian elm, and we'll mention a few more. So what I'm going to do here is mention several invasive species and then look at the suggestions from the Grow Me guide about what could be planted instead. So Japanese knotweed is exceedingly difficult to remove. Its native habitat is in recently erupted or disturbed volcanic slopes. So it's got to be tough to survive where it's native. Even the smallest piece of root will start a new plant, so any retained soil has to be sieved. Warnings include not mowing or cutting without chemical control, as any pruning stimulates growth. It can grow through asphalt and cement 8 centimeters thick. It is an especially serious problem for waterways because it clogs all the banks. It's a huge problem in the UK. It was brought in the 18th century as a pretty plant. And I just read about that. I think they also thought it would help with the banks of their waterways. It's such a problem in the UK, it's considered hazardous waste, and it will impact your property value if you're trying to sell a house. It is a very big problem. There is Japanese knotweed along Hillcrest at Rabbit Rock. The first slide that I had at the beginning of this talk was a picture of Japanese knotweed in the winter along Hillcrest. It's in some back lanes, and I'm sure there's more of it around. This is burning bush. We mentioned this before. There's lots of these around town. I'm not going to tell anybody not to plant anything tonight, okay? But I think it would be good to think about what you have in your garden and where it's planted. So, for instance, I don't own any property that backs onto any forested land. But if you do, I think you could consider to be what you want to plant there so that it doesn't move into the bush. And the other issue is when I was gardening with the group of us, we gardened in a lot of gardens of older people that could no longer take care of their gardens. And you might consider what will happen when somebody else takes over your garden. If they're not a gardener, what's going to take off? Because you might have loved it and controlled it, but the next person that owns the property might not care about it and won't control it. And if you can foresee a problem there, then maybe that's something to consider when you're working in your yard. The burning bush, I have to say, I haven't seen a lot of this in the bush. So, maybe this problem is more prevalent in warmer areas. I don't know. This is a false spirea. We've seen this when I was working with this group. We saw this in at least one client, and we all stood there looking at it and said, I would never grow that. Yeah. This thing will grow into lawn easily, doesn't care. You can mow it, it doesn't care. It's a pretty exuberant plant. I'm not aware of it being grown into the bush anywhere. These are suggestions to grow instead, which includes red twig dogwood, Saskatoon berry. We planted a lot of red and yellow twig dogwoods at the hospital, at the Family Health Center. Also there is common elderberry and bush honeysuckle. So the bush honeysuckle you would have to be looking for a specific name, because I think if you went to a nursery and asked for bush honeysuckle, I'm not sure what you would get. Saskatoons are the first flowering shrub to flower in our area in the spring. There's one at the four-way stop by the hospital. Always looks really pretty early in the spring. And they have a lovely berry if you can beat the birds to the berries. And Virginia creeper. So somebody asked about Virginia creeper already. It's in many gardens around town. This is actually suggested as a native alternative in the Grow Me Guide. But we gardened in a garden that had it along the back fence. And we were continually, every time we visited, we were pruning it to keep it under control. It's native to eastern North America, which is one reason why it's considered an alternative. I don't think it's really native in our area. I haven't seen it anywhere in the bush except just inside the archway to the Four Season Lands. I think maybe some garden debris got left there. And Ray told me another place where it is further down Bombers Bay Road. It'll grow up trees and smother them. When my son moved into his yard on Beach Street, it was growing all over the cedar trees at the back of his property along the back lane. So I tried removing it. They have cedar trees there. It's pretty easy to pull it down. It vigorously sends out new shoots which root all along them. It sends out long roots. I removed roots as long as 2 meters. In fact, I kept a yard bag of Virginia creeper in my shed for a year before I disposed of it. All of the roots were by then brittle. But I am still patrolling the area some 6 years later, because cedar roots are very prolific and they're shallow and it's really hard to get other roots out from underneath them. So there are still some places where Virginia creeper keeps cropping up because I can't get the roots that might be a little further down under the ground. It normally runs its roots only a few inches under the top of the soil, but some of them go deeper. So I personally would not plant it in my yard. Dog strangling vine, we've seen this vine already. It's a vigorous grower that also secretes a chemical to inhibit the growth of other plants. It's native to southern Europe. I don't know what inhibits it in its native area. So we just looked at some vines, and these are vines that are suggested to grow instead. Jackman clematis is one of the oldest clematises around. I'm sure that's still available. Virgin's Bower is our native clematis. It grows all around the parking lot at the forestry along the highway. I've also seen it along the rail bed walking out of Chalk River towards Deep River. So it is in our area for sure. Dropmore scarlet honeysuckle, I believe, was a vine that was developed at the Morden agricultural farm by Agriculture Canada, and it's a reasonably well-behaved vine, as is the last one there, gold flame honeysuckle, also a fairly, I assume since it's here, it's a well-behaved vine. So the only native of all of these is the Virgin's Bower. Okay, so these are grasses. I only have a picture of one of them, which is Phragmites. This ground grass, as I mentioned before, is found along highways all over southern Ontario. I could show you a map of it. This is a huge problem. We were just down in the Leamington area for Easter weekend, which is just sits on top of Point Pewley, and it's a huge problem down there, everywhere. It will invade wetlands so densely that native plants and animals are crowded out. There is actually a native Phragmites. So we do have Phragmites in town. But I spoke to Ray about this, and we think they're probably native. There's a clump on the way out to Tack Point, which has stayed there stable for a long, long time. And there's also some along Miami Beach. If any of you know where Miami Beach is, off of Sea Loop. And actually you can get there from our loop, but no, you can't get there from our loop, except if it's the winter. This is not a nice plant. I'm just looking to see. It's from Europe, but it just reproduces so thickly that it's impossible. I think it's difficult to get rid of too. When my daughter was a student at Niagara College, she was taking an ecosystem restoration course, and there was a field of Phragmites beside their college, and one of the projects they undertook was to remove it from that area. Big job. And I've also mentioned that there is a miscanthus up on the highway. There's 2 cultivars of miscanthus that were on that previous list we looked at. So these are suggested grasses to grow instead. According to the attributes there, big blue stem is a clump forming grass. I'm not sure about Indian grass. I don't have experience with either of those 2 grasses. The third one, sweetgrass, is not clump forming. I had some of that in my yard, and I gave it to someone who wanted it because it just spreads as badly as twitchgrass, and I wasn't interested in trying to contain it. This next section is mostly ground covers. So goutweed. There's a clump of goutweed along the path that goes from Kelvin Crescent over to McElligott. So I think that was probably something that was discarded from discarded yard waste, and you'll never get that out of there. It's all mixed up with everything that is around it. There's just too many roots in there to get it out. I didn't look up to see where it's native. Next one is periwinkle. There's big patches of this on the path that runs from Alexander Place, to Frontenac. It's native to Central and Southern Europe and parts of Northern Africa. Those patches are a perfect example of invasive. Nothing else grows there. They're full of periwinkle. I know they're pretty, but they're invasive. They've likely escaped adjacent property, or garden clippings were discarded there. And some of them probably many years ago before anybody was aware of this. Lily of the Valley is another plant that has a wonderful, robust root system. I've seen this thing grow as much as 1 or even 2 feet deep, and it never stops growing. It was all over my son's yard because obviously the previous owners really liked Lily of the Valley, but the garden wasn't taken care of for probably more than 10 years or even more. And so I have been trying to dig this plant out, and it's almost impossible if it's anywhere close to trees or shrubs that you can't get it out of those roots. I had it grow right into a stone pathway that was like 2 feet deep. So I dug up all my stones and pulled the roots out and pushed it back, and the next time it went into the stone pathway again, and I took it all out. I thought, okay, I don't want to deal with you. This is another interesting plant. I think this plant must have come into town quite a few years ago when people were looking for plants to plant in their gardens. This plant has a very interesting root system. It's like a string with little parsnips attached to it. And if you don't get all those string roots and the parsnips that are attached to it, you don't get all of the plant. I actually dug one up where the root was as big as my forearm. It was huge.
It looks so delicate.
They look very delicate, but they're very tough. And I think there's some growing beside the pathway from the ski hill parking lot into Grouse Park. Last year I took the flowers off. Yellow archangel, this is a ground cover, a lamium. This is a very exuberant lamium. I've seen this spread into the bush from a surrounding garden, so someone who had their garden backed onto bush or beside bush, and it's just grown right into the bush. It just leaps frogs and roots and then keeps on going. Garlic mustard. This was brought to the Muir Beach area by equipment used to build the crushed stone path that's along the back of the beach. So it has spread all over. It prolifically distributes seed and keeps on growing. Elizabeth told me that 10 years ago, she worked with somebody who was in the area to try and deadhead all of the seeds off so they wouldn't spread. Okay, so now I have a couple of slides of ground covers to plant instead. This is bearberry. It is everywhere in our area. It's all over the forestry. It's across a river. It's a really pretty plant. It's actually more like a shrub because it has branches on it. We planted a cultivar of this around the hospital as a ground cover. So, and it's really pretty. It has a rather glossy leaf, and as you can see, it also has berries. This is Canadian wild ginger. There is a European wild ginger that has a smaller, glossier leaf. I have not seen this in our area. The only places I've seen it is at the Mackenzie King Estate in Gatineau and in the Niagara Gorge. But I haven't actually seen it in the bush around here. But I guess I would consider this as a ground cover because it is native to to our country. So I'm off the screen a little bit. So the grow me instead suggestions are bearberry and wild ginger. Foam flower is around here, I think. Wintergreen and bunchberry are on this list. I kind of suspect that they would really want what they see in their native habitat. I don't think you could put them in a garden and see them grow well, because I think they would really want sort of more of a wild and native environment. I'm not sure, well, wild strawberry will grow in a lawn, so I suspect that would be okay, and the other one mentioned there is wild geranium, and that would probably be also okay in a garden setting. Okay, so when Francis and Catherine and I were talking about invasive, somebody told us there was an invasive in Bill Rounding Park, and it's Himalayan balsam. This is an annual, but it produces tons and tons of seed, and it's in Bill Rounding Park at the Beach Street entrance that's across from the Four Seasons Trail. So I think this one is relatively more straightforward to remove because it's an annual. You just have to get the plant out. You don't have to worry so much about the roots, and you want to just make sure that it doesn't produce any seed, although the seed bank that's there would probably continue to produce plants for a few years. And the suggestions to plant instead of this are meadow rue, which is common all around here. It's along our waterways, it's along the ditches. Spotted jewelweed, which touch-me-not is another name for it, I think. Also common, you'll notice it is also, the first Latin name there is, sorry, I have to look at my screen here. impatiens, which the Himalayan balsam is also impatiens. And the other one they suggest is bleeding heart, which also produces a lot of seed. That's a pretty plant. I put wild parsnip in this slide presentation here because this cropped up in Bombers Bay recently. So I heard about this from Ray and also from Elizabeth. Apparently this plant appeared in Bombers Bay area following the installation of the water line to CNL. Its root is edible, belongs to the carrot family, but the sap of the plant can cause severe burns. It looks like Queen Anne's lace, but as you see, it has yellow flowers. Queen Anne's lace has white flowers. We do have some native plants that belong to the carrot family that are poisonous. We brought one home once. Okay, let's take a look at some trees. This is a caragana, which has often in the past been planted as a hedge. I don't think there's too many caragana hedges left around Deep River, but there used to be a caragana hedge behind the monument up at the traffic lights. And when I was up there last year or the year before, I noticed these tall trees that had spines on them and realized that this is caragana. If it's not pruned to be a hedge, it'll grow to about 20 feet, and they're all over behind the monument up there. And they have like little thorns or spines on them, and if you stood up underneath, well, I wouldn't want to stand up underneath one. Non-native honeysuckles were mentioned on that list. These are Tartarian, Amur, Moro, Bells, and European fly honeysuckles. These are probably all over our back lanes, I suspect. I'm not sure, I don't know these well. I think the concern is the amount of berries they have. If they're like the honeysuckle that's in my son's yard, I'm pulling seedlings of that plant out all the time. So instead of those plants, these are suggestions to plant instead. Nannyberry, which is a native. Ninebark is native to eastern North America. They've produced all kinds of different ninebarks, but the basic original plant is native. Fragrant sumac, which is another native, I'm not sure it's native around here, but it's another native plant, and alpine currant, which would also be native. Some other trees that are around, this is are more commonly around town referred to as a Chinese elm, but I looked it up and it's actually Siberian elm. These things produce my neighbor had one of these. They produce so much seed that they would cover my back lawn, so I had to rake it. And otherwise it would have smothered some of the grass. They grow all along the side of Banting, along the marsh there. The Public Works just cut them and trimmed them again last year, but they didn't try and pull them out. They're also back of Rutherford, so along the highway across from Canadian Tire, along the fence line there. And there's some even along the highway as you drive east from the traffic lights past Banting. They're listed as invasive plants in quite a few states in the US. Another tree that we have a few of around, Ray tells me there's one just in inside the archway to the Four Seasons land again, a Norway maple. These things will grow in shade and they produce a lot of seeds. So a little bit like the tree of heaven, which I mentioned earlier, they will literally grow into an area and just fill it with only them so that nothing else can grow. We also have a lot of Tartarian and I know there's quite a few Amur maples around town. They also produce a lot of seed. I'm weeding them out of my yard from my neighbor who's 2 doors up. quite often. They produce a lot of seed. And the other one I want to mention here is Japanese lilacs. There's lots of Japanese lilacs around town, and I was part of deciding to plant one out here in front of the library and put the 2 down at the waterfront. It's really hard to find small trees to plant, and one thing that I was unaware of at the time was that they do produce a lot of seed and a lot of it germinates. So I am pulling a lot of Japanese lilac seedlings out of the library flower bed. And there's some down at the waterfront. I actually asked a horticulturalist at a nursery in Ottawa about them because they're planted all over southern Ontario as landscape trees in a lot of parks. I've noticed them sometimes when we're driving by different areas in the summertime or in the spring. They're hardy to zone 2. And we're traditionally zone 3, although now we're warm enough to be zone 4. And I think what happens is that we're cold enough that the seeds are stratified by the cold in the winter and they germinate. This is not a problem in Ottawa. And it must not be a problem in southern Ontario because I don't think they would be planting them. She was surprised. I was surprised. She was surprised. So trees to grow instead. Well, just about any native tree would be a good idea. There's different varieties of maple listed there, sugar, silver, and Freeman maples. Basswood is an option, except Japanese beetles like them. So that's maybe not an option. They are attracted by the blossoms, and if you've had a basswood in your property, they will have prolific blossoms. And the last one that's mentioned here is hackberry. Okay, so what do we do about invasives? We can try pulling them by hand, which maybe we can do with Himalayan balsam. Depending on where they live, it might be hard. You could maybe dig and sift for small pieces of root or rhizome. You could try keeping on cutting them and then cutting them again, because eventually if there is no green on the plant theoretically should not do well and maybe even not survive. Smothering them with a tarp or thick mulch might work for some of them. Solarizing, and by this I believe they mean to cover it with plastic. I again mentioned the quick reference guide to manage invasive plants in Ontario. And the Ontario Invasive Plant Council, all of these websites, many of them have fact sheets and guides on how to get rid of many of the invasive plants. So, you know, before you dig and start on this, if you're not sure what you're dealing with, it's good to go and look for some information first. There is an invading species hotline, and there's a website called EDD Maps, where you can report or identify a place where an invasive plant is growing. I don't know that anybody would show up at your door, but if you can go and look at that map, you know it might be in your area. I'll show you a map from this in a couple of slides. This is off of the Invasive Species Center. You can see their logo down here. These are tips for invasive species. Never discard the waste in nearby natural areas. Avoid composting invasive plant material and seeds. Dispose of invasive seeds by placing them in a sealed plastic bag, then in a second sealed plastic bag. This tells you how serious this problem is. Place invasive plant materials in construction-grade plastic bags and set out on a hard surface in the sun for 1 to 2 weeks. This might make your property unsightly. And then dispose of with your garbage, not in compost. So I think you know, this is of course many of the worst case scenarios, but it pays to be careful here because we live in a beautiful area that is promoted as being a beautiful area to be able to get into the bush on a lot of our trails and in this area. And we don't want these plants to grow into the bush. Japanese knotweed. I really want to emphasize that Japanese knotweed is a difficult case. Do not try to remove this plant unless you have done some research. Be extremely careful of how you dispose of it. Seeds can survive out of the ground, and the smallest root piece can be the beginning of another plant. I found at least 2 resources that emphasize that doing nothing is better than not doing enough when removing it. We really want to keep this plant out of our waterways. As far as I know, it is not in our waterways yet, and in as few locations as possible. Notice the cautions at the bottom. Other manual control methods, including mowing or cutting, unless combined with chemical control, may increase densities by stimulating growth. These methods are not effective for long-term control. Make sure that all equipment, boots, clothing, etc. are cleaned at the site to ensure seeds are not transported from the site. See the Ontario Invasive Plant Council's Clean Equipment Protocol for more details. So Japanese knotweed is not nice stuff. This is what the quick reference guide to managing invasive plants in Ontario is, just the cover of it so that you know what it looks like. Okay, so EDD maps that I mentioned before. This is a map that shows where locations of Japanese knotweed that have been reported. You notice there's nothing for Deep River right here. There's 2 on base Petawawa, 6 in Petawawa, 11 in Pembroke. You can see the number in the Ottawa area. This is all over. It's a problem. And that's what the map looks like on EDD Maps. So you can go on this website and choose a plant out of their, they have extensive lists, not just of plants, but of everything. And you can pull up a map that shows where reported sightings of the different species are.
Excuse me, Bob.
Yes.
There's a huge growth in the Petawawa Research Forest. Near
Oh,
the,
yes, there is, yes.
Just near the old chimney. And
Yes.
Just down the road. Huge.
Huge,
growth
yes.
there.
Yes. But that would have to be dealt with. That would have to be organized by somebody and dealt with. The clump of Japanese knotweed that's along Hillcrest there at Rabbit Rock. Several years ago, I researched that topic and found the guide for removing it at the time. It must be 5 years ago or more, and gave it to Public Works. At one time, they dug some of it out. I think that knotweed came from a neighbor across the street, and they just left it there at the side of the road or at the edge of the bush. At one time, Public Works went in there and cleaned some of it out, but they followed their normal protocol, which was to send it through a chipper and blast it back into the bush, which is the last thing you want to do with Japanese knotweed, which they didn't. You know, you can't expect Public Works to know every plant that's around in people's gardens in town. So the more recent one that they did, they dug it up and wrapped it up in a tarp and buried it down about 10 feet down in the old sewage treatment containers. So that one probably won't surface again. But in the meantime, of course, it just regenerates and grows again. So I mean, I found a website, I think it was a Facebook page from Sault Ste. Marie, and oh my goodness, the guy was adamant, you're better off leaving this plant alone, don't touch it. Because if you touch it, like somebody wanted to build a patio and they dug it all out and put down their crushed stone and built their patio, and the Japanese knotweed came in between all of their bricks. They probably even put landscape fabric down. That's not going to stop Japanese knotweed. And it came up through all of the bricks and everything. It was like, this is not an ordinary regular plant. This requires some serious research. And if you have an area of it and you can, for instance, maybe there's a few stray plants that are a little further away, start there and contain it a little bit. But really, you need to do some research before you try and touch this plant. So where do we go from here? Yes?
I was just gonna add a point about Japanese knotweed. Like, the root is the toughest root I've ever tried to chop up. I was trying to make it into medicine because Japanese knotweed is actually great for helping to treat Lyme disease. And I was like, I cut up the rootlets, or as much of the outer part of the root as I could, but with my sharpest knife, I couldn't get through the center of the root. It's tough.
Yeah, so when you think of where it's native, none of this is surprising, right? Volcanic beds, like they're going to be tough as nails. Yes, Elizabeth?
I also heard or read that it can survive for 5 years, like a piece of root, a small piece of root can survive.
Yeah.
Years, so
Oh, I wouldn't be surprised.
you can't just,
Isn't nature amazing?
yeah.
Yes?
So what about chemical control of other slides?
Yeah, that would be glyphosate, right? Roundup.
Is that effective?
Okay, one of the websites that I was looking at, and this might be, they're using industrial applications of it. Probably not what you would, not your spray bottle that you bought behind the glass at Canadian Tire. Maybe you could syringe it directly into the stem. That might work, but I really don't know. I just really think that you have to do some research and maybe even find somebody that can help you.
Yeah, I've used that chemical spray several times, and you have to apply it several years.
Yes.
And you have to make sure you follow directions properly.
Yeah.
Spraying it in the active growing season, not at the end of the season, not at the beginning of the season.
Yeah.
But it takes 2 or 3 applications to be effective, and you have to be consistent. You have to really do it.
Yeah. You have to be persistent because the plant is very persistent. Yeah. Yeah. It's not a good one. Okay, so where do we go from here? If any of you are interested, where do we go from here? These are suggestions that different people that helped me with this presentation came up with. Creating a map and plotting locations of patches of invasive species. Start a native plant and seed exchange locally. There are a couple of nurseries that sell native plants in our area. One of them is, no, I'm not going to remember the name. Knott's. So Knott's switched to, they used to produce a lot of bedding plants, but he's semi-retired, but he does still produce native plants, which they sell on their Facebook page. They could be sold out already, Elizabeth.
Some, but still lots left.
Okay. There's also a nursery in, I think, Eganville called I'm not sure exactly the name. If you Google looking for native nurseries in the Ottawa area, you might find it. They used to be located, I think, on the Quebec side, closer to Ottawa, but they've relocated to the Eganville area. Some of the natives have what we call nativars, so they're based on the native plant, but a nursery has usually selectively chosen them and continued to breed them to find a plant that we would find more preference for in a garden. So something, for instance, that wouldn't be as leggy and might have a better shape than what is in the wild. We planted quite a few nativars at the Family Health Center. Bearberry, we were looking for like 80 plants of bearberry, and I asked Knott first, but he could not supply that number, so we ended up with a nativar from the nursery to plant instead. But it's still a stock that would have the basic DNA from the native plant, which is better than one that's not native. So there are a couple around. I haven't visited a lot of others in the Ottawa area. So the fourth one is to continually ask for native species, and maybe the nurseries will get the idea that there's a demand, so they'll make sure that they have them in stock. Organizing a community volunteer event to tackle a particular species or area. This was done in our area. It was spearheaded by Ray to work on purple loosestrife before the beetle was released. There were quite a few people that went out and dug up loosestrife along our shorelines.
Did that work?
Yep.
I think it helped, and also we had students from ranger camps came and did the waterfront area in particular in town. I think they came and did that a few times. But you have to keep doing it. The beetle helped a lot more. And there's, having a list of people to contact if someone in private property wants help trying to dig an invasive out of their yard. A lot of them, if you're particular and good with a garden fork, you can get a lot of these out. They're not that difficult, but you have to be persistent. And we do have a list of resources. So if you want to take a piece of paper home, I think it's over here on the table. Okay, so questions. Anybody have questions? Yes?
How deep typically is the root of the Phragmites?
I haven't dug up Phragmites, so I can't answer. I think they're pretty deep. I was just telling somebody, one of the things about nature is pretty amazing. My daughter told me that if you wanted to restore a wetland, all you'd have to do is take all of the fill that's on the top of it and take it off, and the wetland would reappear again because all of the seeds and the rootstock is underneath, and it doesn't die just because you cover it up, which is totally amazing. The trouble with these plants is they're amazing, but they're in the wrong place, right? So Phragmites, I think, is a big issue because it's all over the place in southern Ontario. The map for, how am I going to get out of here? Let me see if I can do this. I did pull up the map for Phragmites. This is the map for Phragmites for Ontario. So look at those numbers. Those dots are like 174, 93, 35, 14, 33, and they're all across southern Ontario. It's a huge issue. I was just in the Leamington area, as I mentioned, and one of the areas have a big marsh there called Hillman Marsh, which is just east of Point Pelee National Park. And they have one area blocked off because there's a water plant there that has invaded the area. It's the first infestation in Canada. That's what the sign said. And I don't recall the plant anymore because I've forgotten it, but it was a plant from aquariums. So if you're getting rid of your goldfish or your plants from your aquariums, please put them in the garbage. Don't flush them down the toilet. Don't pour them out on the water line on the shores. So that's what all of this goes back to, is You know, what you have, you bought it, think of how you're going to get rid of it, right? Any other questions? Ray?
You didn't mention blackcurrant and gooseberry and the connection to white pines, which was the biggest deal when we first came
Yes.
to Deep River.
And some of the new varieties of those are supposed to not carry them. But I don't know about that. So there is a disease called white pine blister rust that our white pines get. That's often why we have dead white pines in the area. We used to have one in our backyard, which had white pine blister rust, and that disease has a host, a shrub host, that's in between when the, that's like a fungus, isn't it?
It is a fungus.
Yes, it is a fungus. So the,
It's the alternate host to white pine blister rust.
but it has to be on the alternate host before it can go back on a pine tree, I think. Or am I wrong,
Correct.
Richard?
It spends 3 spore stages on white pine and 2 spore stages on ivy species, which are currants or gooseberries.
Right,
And it alternates back and forth
Yes.
every season. So on white pine in the spring, right about now,
mm-hmm.
and then on gooseberries and currants in the fall. And then it goes back to, I should say in the summer, and then it goes back to the pine in the fall.
So sometimes you have, like, the white pine that we had in our backyard was all green in the fall. It probably died over the winter, and in the spring, once it heated up, it was completely brown. It's totally,
If you
totally
come
dead.
on Friday, you'll hear a lot more about
Right.
But what I will say, because I won't be talking about the aspect about currants, and that currants not being safe. All currants are susceptible to the white pine blister rust cycle. There was back in the States, they developed a black currant that they thought was resistant for the longest time. And then they realized initially that they were releasing this. So it's against the law to grow currants in many states, in the United States. And that's because of white pine blister rust. Eventually they came up with a currant they thought was resistant to getting the spores from white pine trees. And when they released those for many years, they weren't totally resistant. So the disease persisted and people were growing black currants in their gardens thinking that they were resistant, but they weren't. Nowadays, there are some resistant varieties.
Of
So
those,
how far does the current have to be from the white pine?
good question.
Okay, so that's a very good question. So back in the Dust Bowl days and right up to the 60s, the province of Ontario and most states that have white pine had people going out pulling ribes. Ribes are gooseberries and currants. It's a genus for both. Pulling them out of the forest, and it was a big, big deal, and they spent lots of money doing that. What they didn't realize is what we heard today, is that pulling these plants out, if you're not doing a really good job and leaving any roots, they come back with vengeance.
Yeah.
The other aspect, to answer your question directly, the spores from the gooseberries only travel about 900 feet to 1,000 feet. So they don't go very far to the pines. But when the disease is on the pine trees, they can go hundreds of kilometers because they're light wind spores, where the gooseberry spores are very heavy and very susceptible to desiccation. So they need.
And the trees are
40 hours.
taller too, so they'd launch them from a higher height, so.
Well, but not all the infection. If you come on Friday, you'll find out
Okay.
there's a lot of misconceptions.
I'm coming on Friday. Yes,
So you mentioned that there's Virgin's Bower.
Yes.
Up by Chalk or,
yeah, I
Friday
have,
Road.
I mentioned the areas where I've seen it.
that's right, yeah. that
If
there's
you,
some
if
there.
you look in the fall, you'll see it, yeah.
And we've also talked about the difficulty of getting native plants. So can you discuss the danger or good things about going and finding it in Chalk River and bringing it home?
I don't think anybody recommends going and digging stuff out of the bush. If enough people did it, you wouldn't have anything left. So I would not condone that. I know lots of people, I have stuff in my garden, like I have white trilliums. It came from my father's property and he was going to move a road. And it was full of trilliums, so I was digging them up because he was going to put a road there. So I think maybe all of us or some, but it's better if you could find the seed and grow it. I don't think we should be all heading out to the bush with a fork or a shovel and taking stuff out of the bush. Is that what you're asking?
Yeah,
Yeah, I don't think we should be doing that. Yes, Elizabeth.
I don't find it hard at all to find native plants. You just need to
Look.
make an effort. Like there's an online mail order nursery called onplants.ca. They just specialize in selling native plants. They ship them out to your house. Like if you look at Gerber's nursery at Sunset, they have a lot of native plants. You just need to know what they are and do a little bit of research when you're there. I always have my phone and I put in the name of a plant that looks pretty, and then I say plus invasive, and if a bunch of hits come up, then that's up, like, no. Or say, put in the name of the plant and say native range and see if it's an Eastern Canada plant. And so I think it's just kind of changing how you shop at nurseries, not just like what looks beautiful in the moment when you're there, and then you get it home and you're not quite sure what you're putting in the ground. But I think it's not so hard to find them anymore. That's my comments.
Okay, somebody else had their hand up? Yeah.
So about the Virginia creeper, somebody mentioned to me, like I have the ginormous red and white pines behind my house there, that they can actually hurt the mature trees. Is that true? Like, so I was pulling them down, sort of cutting them, and of course the vines are going way.
Yeah.
They're like, does that hurt the tree at all?
Francis, where are you? So you've pulled the Virginia creeper off of trees in Bill Rounding Park. And I pulled them down, like they were growing all over the cedars at my son's place. And, he wants the cedars to be there. I would suspect that they would crowd things out. I don't know what controls them, where they grow like natively, and I don't know where they grow in the bush. Like I think they're in the northeastern U.S., but I don't know what controls them there. There are a lot of vines in Point Pelee National Park, because I was just there. I don't know what they are though. It could be Virginia creeper. I'm not sure. I could just see the vines at this point. There were no leaves on them. So I don't know how to answer your question, but this thing, it was such a chore to get it out of my son's backyard that I wouldn't grow it in mine.
Yeah.
It was like I'm still patrolling it 6 years later. I go up and down his patch at the back at least twice a summer with a fork and dig out what I see, but the basic roots that are underneath that are sending up the shoots are probably down a little ways, and I'm dealing with other roots to get at them, and I can't get my hands on them. And I have pulled a lot out.
Yeah.
And in retrospect, like, there's a lot of things here that I never considered either before the last, say, few years. Maybe I shouldn't have gotten rid of those roots the way I did, but I do keep them in my shed for a year, and not just the first big bag that I dug out. Anything else I take out, I put it in a plastic bag and stick it in the back of my shed, and I don't get rid of it for a year.
I'm feeling bad because I got like 3 big paper bags of Virginia creeper that I put into the town hall.
Maybe they're okay there because they create a big pile.
Okay.
I can't say that I've ever seen Virginia creeper growing down there. They've taken a lot of the soil out of there, but when we used that soil in the garden, like we used it in the garden behind the town hall, we didn't have anything growing out of it. It was really good. It was really good soil. It had a bit of garbage in it. They got their summer students to dig the garbage out, pull the garbage out before they brought it up to us, but it was far better than any of the topsoil they gave us. So, any other questions? Yes, Catherine. No problem.
So my brother gave us English daisies, because we needed something to grow in the front that has very, very poor soil.
Mm-hmm.
And they just go crazy, and I cut them back every year, fine. But I was thinking about what you said, not only thinking ahead to someone who might not be trimming them, but also birds and whatever. So if I have something that's just going kind of, really goes wild in your garden, should you be thinking about checking it out to see if it's,
You certainly could do that if you know the Latin name, like if you know what the name of it is to look, I would look it up to see if,
Okay.
what you can find out about it, right? So I'm not telling you not to mow your oxeye daisies, okay? They do look pretty, and most of us probably wouldn't care if we have daisies in our lawn. But they produce a ton of seed. And I weeded so many of them out of the library flower bed, it was incredible. Kind of blew me away. Yeah.
Are there no government programs that actively attack, get rid of invasive
There's a
species
lot
or
of
particularly-
programs like Master Gardeners in Toronto. There's a lot of community-driven stuff like that. I think
But it'd be nice if, you know, you have this patch of knotweed here and, you know, you have a specialist group that knows exactly what has to be done.
I
the
think
tools
you'd
and-
be paying for that.
Okay, okay.
I don't think that's not a service that the government's going to provide. So you would have to then bring in somebody, and if you're bringing in somebody like that, I would want to know how competent they are before I contemplated that. So, you know, most of what we have in town is, a lot of it can be dealt with not without, I think, a lot of trouble. It's the knotweed that's really the issue. And you know, like I had a discussion with Ray while I was preparing this, and he warned me that there's other things like buckthorn, and what was the other one you said? Do you remember? Buckthorn is another one that will grow virtually anywhere. I believe it's from Europe, and they have a huge problem with it. Joan Doubt was telling me about it. Like it literally grows everywhere, so it's so thick you can't even walk through the bush anymore. Ottawa, okay.
regions of Ottawa?
Yeah, so, you know, and we're only talking plants here. We're not talking Japanese beetles and a lot of other things. We're only talking plants. Okay, I think we're done. Thank you for coming.
Thank you so much, Barb, for such an informative presentation this evening. I hope that the conversation continues. I mean, perhaps right here, right now, and going forward in our community. And thank you again for all of your work and sharing your knowledge, Barb. It was excellent. I took a lot of
problem.
photos.
Thank you very much for coming. There's coffee and cookies.